So thank you all. I'm really very happy to be here and to be invited to share some of my work. Some of you know that I'm out on maternity leave this semester, but one of my priorities since I first got to campus has been to get involved more at the center. I wasn't trained as a historian of science or in science and technology studies, but the more time I spend in this setting, the more I think it's a kind of a natural habitat for me. Because really, in a way, I'm a historian of quantification, typically in a business setting rather than a science or technology setting. But I see accounting as a kind of information technology, and that's what I'm going to spend time talking today. And it's especially exciting to be in front of an audience that is particularly interested in topics like quantification and technology. It means my usual stock opening joke about how boring accounting isn't probably doesn't work. But I hope it also means that you won't mind if I put up an extraordinary array of tables and charts and even some pictures of desks to take us through this Atlantic information technology. So today I'm hoping to do two things. The first of them is to conduct a kind of genealogy of management blanks. So I've tried to, in a way, my book project is organized around the development of blank forms that are used in management on plantations and later in factories. So I'm going to go through a kind of genealogy that starts in the West Indies and arrives in the American South. Elsewhere in the project, I take it even further forward to factories in New England, but here I'm going to focus on the research I've been doing most recently, which is focused on the Caribbean in the late 18th and the 19th century. And I'll analyze a series of blanks and talk about how they became a pretty sophisticated information technology for moving and storing information. And then in the second half of the talk, which I've titled the title of the talk, Slavery, Scientific Management, I want to move to the antebellum South. Some of you have heard some of this material before, but this is where the moving and storing of information becomes a setting where you have people analyzing information with great detail. They do forecasting, they calculate productivity of slaves, and so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the way the antebellum planters learned from the West Indies, but also begin to put numbers to work in new ways. And then I'll give some comments at the end about quantification and control, and really about why it's so important to study quantification in this setting of American slavery. But first, let's start with a form. So this is a record from Friendship Plantation. This was a plantation in British Guiana, and it was owned by an absentee merchant in London named William King. King owned a huge range of plantations, and we'll see records from several of them today. In British Guiana, Friendship, Good Success, Hope and Experiment, and several others, and then also he had holdings in Trinidad and the Dominican, what's now the Dominican Republic. So what is this form that we're looking at that would have been sent back to King from across the Atlantic? So down the left-hand side of the form, we have all of the different occupations on the plantation. In the field, about the works on different jobs, house servants, coopers and smiths, carpenters, masons. It continues all the way down. Nurses and cooks, pregnant women, in the hospital and the yaw house, invalids and aged, children under 12, and then absent. Across the top, you get a kind of demographic profile. It's not in great detail, but we have men and women, boys and girls, and children, which are those under 12, and then the children. So what someone could do is to record the enslaved demographically, record them by occupation, and if everyone had been accounted for, the two directions would sum up to this grand total of 342 enslaved peoples who were laboring on the plantation. On the right-hand side, we have a tabulation of increase and decrease. Of course, increase and decrease are this kind of chilling accounting notation for birth and death and sale. And here, as so often was the case on these West Indian plantations, we have a decrease filled, but increase left blank. The boy Francis Bailey died of dysentery, so a loss of 1. So what do we get from this plantation account book? I mean, the first and most striking thing, and the thing that kind of course, hits people the first time they look at these records, is the kind of violence of the accounts, the commodification of human labor being classified and quantified in these ways. And indeed, a number of historians have written about kind of the violence of the plantation archives. Cynthia Hartman, Jennifer Morgan, Stephanie Smallwood, they've all critiqued the structures of business archives and the ways they erase details of human lives. So much was recorded here, but also so little. In many ways, my project is about asking what we can learn from these accounts, not by setting aside the theme of violence, but by asking what role it played in the production of new technologies. Why something that strikes us now as violent went along with such an intense process of quantification. So what does this account tell us from a more business history perspective? So the first thing that blew me away about the account was about the complexity of operations. So you have not only these more than a dozen possible occupations that slaves are being trained in, but you also have the bookkeeper re-recording and adding additional categories because they find that complexity to be insufficient. This is not only a kind of record of birth and death of the demographics, it's also a kind of proto-organizational chart that shows us where all different kinds of slaves were employed on the plantation. But not only this, it gives us a view of the future. The planter can look at these different categories and ages, and some accounts have much finer breakdowns by age, and see how the demographics of the plantation map against the many occupations. So they can see not only how the kind of labor is arrayed now, but whether they need to be training people in skilled positions. You can see there are two boys being trained as coopers and smiths, as boatmen, and then also whether there are problems with too many slaves being sick. So this is a kind of long-term forecasting perspective to see how labor is going to evolve on the plantation. It also, despite the kind of complexity that you can see in this single record, there's also a lot of complexity that's missing from it. This organizational chart, of course, only includes the enslaved. Had we been able to see above this the kind of layers of white staff on the plantation, you'd see even greater complexity. Typically, the structure included an attorney or land agent at the top, an overseer below them a set of bookkeepers, and below the bookkeepers as many drivers as there were gangs of slaves. And these layers of management all made these regular accounting forms essential, as people sent information up and down hierarchies and across the Atlantic back to England. Some plantations had as many bookkeepers as you might find in a small counting house. For just one example, in the 1780s, the Barham family's Jamaican plantations island in Mesopotamia employed 7 different bookkeepers. Now, in some ways, the name bookkeeper is a bit of a misnomer. People have argued that it was a marketing term to lure young clerks across the Atlantic. They came thinking they were going to keep books, and they arrived and discovered they actually had to keep swine. So it wasn't all a glamorous job. But when people were advertising to attract these young white men, they saw accounting and record keeping as a crucial part of their work. And the proliferation of all of these blank forms shows how important people thought these records were. You didn't have to know accounting to complete it. You only had to be able to report, to write an ad. But then the absentee proprietor could expect a regular form of records to reach him. So I want to just walk through some of these different accounts. Here's one of the earliest monthly reports I have for Plantation Hope and Experiment from June of 1812. And this follows the typical layout for one of these plantation account books. On the left-hand side, you have a record of daily labor. So for every single day in June, and if you can see closely, you have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday going down the side. You have the date, the weather, and then a series of categories that show where the slave's labor was allocated. So if we zoom in, we can see some of the same categories we saw in the last document. In the field, in the hospital, in the house watchman, and so it continues across the top in all different categories of labor. So William King, the absentee proprietor back in London, could at a single glance see how labor was distributed on a specific day over the course of time. And these blank forms were only the kind of tip of the iceberg of the plantation accounting system, because this wasn't the first time this information was written down. As in many accounting systems, it's a process of recording and re-recording, where you're summarizing information over time. So this information was likely taken out of a larger book of accounts that contained much more granular detail about what each slave did on each day. Now, we don't have the book for Hope and Experiment, but this is what it might have looked like. This is a record from Prospect Plantation in Jamaica from 1788. This is the list of the enslaved. And then this page has space for commentary and daily occurrences, then a number of columns to record all all of the different types of labor that were taking place on the plantation. This particular record was actually printed in London by a London stationer and sent back to sent to Jamaica. But a lot of the records may have been printed in the colonies themselves. So the previous record I looked at was a record of cotton picking. Here are two more just to show you the continuing complexity of the documents. The top one, Plantation Good Success, breaks down the categories of labor for sugar planting. If you could read those across the top, we see men, women, boys, girls, about the boiling works, watchmen and stock keepers, tradesmen, boatmen, house servants in the hospital, nurses in the yaws house, children at work, infants, invalids, and absent. The list at the bottom is even more extensive, though in this case they break all of the categories down by adults and children, again creating this kind of demographic projection of how the workforce looks today, but also how they expect the workforce to evolve over time. And you can also find hand-drawn forms that look like this. Now, of course, with a hand-drawn form, the attorney and the agent back in London couldn't expect to have the same standardization of results. So these two plantations, for example, are owned by the same person. So the fact that they're in the similar format would enable comparisons. But you have hand-drawn examples of this that have even more complex categories, down to the occupational category of the rat catcher. Sugar plantations had to keep good track of their rats, and you actually see accounting recommendations that you have an account book dedicated to keeping track of rats that are killed on the plantation, and some of the enslaved are dedicated as rat catchers. So this is an incredibly complex operation. And just to show you a picture of the complexity, I don't have the records to do the reconstruction of the full organizational chart for these plantations, but I've been working on an organizational chart for another set of plantations in Jamaica. So these are all of the holdings of the estates of Henry Dawkins that were managed by an attorney named John Schickel. On the left-hand side are the ones in St. Catherine's Parish, and on the right-hand side, those in Clarendon and Vere. And in total, there are some 2,500 enslaved people laboring on these plantations, all of which are being managed by Schickel, who's sending reports back to Dawkins back in England. So this is a very, very large account. And if you look at the free staff on just the largest of those, you have an attorney that's dedicated to that estate, 2 different clerks, an overseer, a storekeeper, a bookkeeper, 2 more bookkeepers, a carpenter, and a doctor's assistant. So, and it's a very large white staff, and it's an even larger array of enslaved peoples who are classified by their skills again. So this is a surprising level of sophistication in terms of, if you're thinking about where what corporation planning in the American colonies looked like in textile mills and iron forges, even quite a bit later than this. So if daily labor monitoring is one focus of these accounts, another focus is on that category of increase and decrease. This is the back side of the form from Hope and Experiment that I referred to previously. On the left-hand side, you have articles received and delivered. So this is the bales of cotton, how much they weigh and what they were sent for. And then at the top right, you have the Negro accounts and the livestock accounts. Zooming in on those, you see that this is again that kind of chilling account of birth and death. And in an eerie way, the account of slaves' births and deaths looks almost identical to the account of livestock. The same thing is true in an almost identical form from Good Success. Here we have the Negro account, the livestock account, with the only difference being that you have a more degree of granularity, sold, died, and killed, whereas under the Negro account you only see died. So these are, in some ways, they're balance sheets of human lives. They take an accounting practice that was usually done in dollars and they apply it in the units of men and women. So the way they begin is that you take an inventory of those enslaved who remained on the plantation last month. So here there are 206 total. Then you have the increase, that's anyone who's born, and there's 1. And so from last month plus the one that's born, you get 207. On the other side, you have decrease. Here there's been no decrease, so you take an inventory at the end of the month and you see it sums to 207. So this is a way that at a single glance, the planter, even an absentee planter, could see that every man and woman who he owned was accounted for. Now this, of course, is the parallel between the slave account and the livestock account is kind of really chilling from a modern perspective. I mean, the fact that the kind of commodification is operating in identical ways. And this was very, very common throughout plantation records, that the livestock account would resemble the account of slaves. Those parallels sometimes operated in unexpected ways. On the Barham plantation accounts in Jamaica, they actually have inventories, and the inventories of the enslaved and the inventories of cattle look almost the same, down to the fact that the cattle have been named individually, and you can actually only tell by the intervals of birth and death that these are not the same kind of set of people. So they, in some ways, they resemble each other in a kind of eerie and expected ways, but there are also ways that the slaves and animals were accounted for in similar and very unexpected ways. Some critics of slavery, the disturbing parallels weren't lost on them. One critic of slavery, Andrew Thompson, remarked on the ways that the practice of accounting erased the violence of the slave trade. As he explained, an apprentice might be employed in the writing of invoices and instructions for those who were commissioned to kidnap or purchase cargo, and by this means he would become familiar with the chains and bolts and other trappings of the diabolical traffic. He would become accustomed to noting in the ledger, under the head of profit and loss, a number of men, women, and children purchased in Africa, of whom so many were thrown overboard and so many were found unsaleable. Through his daily calculations, he would become inured to all the horrors of the system. And by the time the young apprentice became a partner, he would feel no more remorse in fitting up a ship for the purpose of trading in human flesh than he would have done in sending her to catch whales or seals. So even, in some ways, our discomfort with this type of form is a bit of a projection, but abolitionists at the time were already observing that these kind of parallel logics for men and humans would have this, would lead to people thinking more and more abstractly about human lives. So how did these forms work? Well, the forms were sent back across the Atlantic, and in some ways you can think about them as the software in a system of Atlantic information technology. So here's this form in its full size, and you can see that it has been folded up into a small bundle. You have all the results up top, and there are more results in the bottom. And then it was folded into a little packet, and then it would be labeled with where it was sent, its contents, and the year. Now these little individual documents, having been labeled, would then be bundled up into pigeonholes. And then each bundle would be bound together, and another label would be folded over the top of all of the bundles, and that would be labeled. Now, if you've ever encountered a box, has anybody ever opened a box of these in the archive? It's both a blessing and a curse. First, you open the box, you find that all of the things are open like this. It would take probably the time of your whole trip to the archive to unbundle them and rebundle them in the way that you're supposed to in the archive. On the other hand, they're amazingly well organized. These aren't just like kind of people gathering up their junk mail, bundling them together and putting them in a form. They're actually precisely labeled, and usually within the pigeonhole bundle, they're in the exact right order. So if you're looking for a particular date or a particular place, or an account of a particular life, it's very, very easy to locate, because this was in some ways a kind of sophisticated, like a database system where someone could package something away and it would be very easy to recover a particular piece of information. So this is returns on labor from January 1st, 1827 to 1829. And if you wanted the return on labor from 1828, March, you could find it in a matter of minutes. Not only that, but the fact that they're bundled probably means that the records are all totally pristine. When I open these, you find that these records are in better shape than almost any other record you look at. And I've encountered pigeonhole bundles like these actually in the archives in Barbados. And as you might imagine, archives in Barbados don't have sophisticated climate control. They feel much worse than this room all the time. They're incredibly humid, and you get bundles that are like eaten through with worms. But things that are packed tightly like this are incredibly well preserved, because it's very difficult for anything to meet them. So if you think about these as the kind of software of this Atlantic information technology, you can think about specialized desks as the hardware. If you look through cabinet makers' catalogs from the same period of time, you find that they contain large arrays of pigeonholes, and those documents were meant to be folded up and sorted into their correct pigeonhole. When the pigeonhole was full, they could be bundled together and placed into storage in this kind of preserving technique that both kept the record safe for a long period of time, but also made it easy to access a particular record. So these planters were at the cutting edge of developing a system of information that enabled these bundles to be shipped across the ocean and actually to kind of survive what was a very, very difficult passage. I have found references to ships of spaces called pigeonholes. I haven't ever been able to find this kind of documentation that this is actually what they're for, but there may have been spaces on ships that are specifically intended for these pigeonhole packets. And here's another, just one more example of potential designs you could have for your pigeonholes. And if you skip forward from the late 18th century to the mid 19th century in a bit of a detour, you get finally the king of desks, the Wooten desk, which is a pigeonhole system that's meant to accommodate a huge array of documents. Now these desks, the Wooten desk was actually probably more about conspicuous consumption than it was about doing your filing. This is right around the time that horizontal and vertical filing are taking over from the pigeonhole system. But looking at the desks, I think, helps to see the sophistication in this kind of bundling system. If you think about like the criteria for what makes a database work, preserving the information over time and keeping it easy to access, the system worked remarkably effectively. And while you can find other blank forms, these are also quite unusual. So if you think of the earliest forms like this that I've found are from the late 18th century, from the 1780s. You can find other partially filled, partially blank documents for quite a bit earlier in ship's logs. So ship's logs often were partially printed. You can find them in certain legal documents like indentured that were partially printed, partially blank. But this is the first setting that I've found. It's dangerous to claim anything is the first. But this is by the earliest setting that I've seen where these types of forms are used in the management of labor. You don't see similar forms emerging in factories until well into the 19th century. So how does this all connect to the American South? Or is it just a West Indian story? That's what I wanted to spend the next few minutes talking about, is connecting the story in the West Indies on sugar plantations to the emergence of similar but eventually far more sophisticated accounting practices in the American South. And I'll start with yet another form. Now if you go through this form and you find that it is basically exactly the same in layout as the forms we've been looking at. Like the Hopen, this is a prototype that's printed in a magazine, and all of the forms that appear here not only appear here also in the Hopen experiment and Good Success records, but they actually appear in almost the exact same order. So this was published in Edmund Ruffin's Farmer's Register. Ruffin was a Virginia wheat planter who was hugely invested in agricultural experimentation and the study of soils, the study of manures. And he published the Farmer's Register, which had a nationwide circulation for about a decade. And across that decade, this is one of only maybe 2 or 3 full-page spreads that he publishes illustrating something. And this is the illustration of West Indian methods suited for a southern plantation. They were submitted to Ruffin by a man named Farquhar McRae, who came to the United States in 1834, following the British abolition of slavery in Jamaica. So Farquhar McRae arrives in the U.S. and he chooses to begin planting sugar in Florida. And he styles himself an elite planter who's accustomed to planting on a large scale, and he trades on this kind of West Indian mystique in order to advertise his knowledge to other American planters. Now in reality, McRae was perhaps a bit more of a huckster than his articles would actually suggest. He says he planted sugar on a large scale. If you look through the records from the compensation that was paid by the British government after emancipation, you find that he actually owned 11 enslaved men and women, and he probably was not a planter himself, maybe a bookkeeper or a manager on a plantation. But in any case, he submits this form to the Farmers Register. They publish it in all its detail, and he writes that he plans to have it printed and bound for distribution to American planters. It doesn't look like he actually got around to printing it himself. He dies in a steamer accident a couple of years later. But this format of the partially printed, partially blank ledger becomes incredibly common on American plantations. Starting in the 1840s, you have a series of people, beginning with Thomas Affleck, who print not only regular reports, but actually account books that have every form you need to run a plantation. These are even more complex than the records we've been looking at for the West Indies. So this one, which is the one that was on the poster for the event, is Thomas Affleck's Plantation Record and Account Book. That book contained 16 different forms that a planter or his overseer was supposed to fill out every day over the course of a year. Some of them were filled out daily, some of them were filled out quarterly, some of them were filled out yearly. The forms included an annual balance sheet where they estimated their profits, inventories of everything on the plantation from hoes to the slaves, and also records of all of the produce of the plantation. But by far the most important record was the record of cotton picked. That's the record that's featured in the advertisement, and it's the single page that everyone who bought this book always filled out. They sometimes didn't use some of the other forms, but they always filled out the record of cotton picked. Down the left-hand side, you had the names of all the slaves toiling on the plantation, and across the top you had the days of the week. And under every header, the number of pounds every slave picked every day. And off to the far right, you have the total weeks picking. So ranging up to 1,600 or 1,700 pounds. This is from 1860, down to slaves who are picking only maybe a quarter that much. And when people are not doing other tasks, you sometimes see that noted. This, I think, says that the person's delivered a baby. There's no way to tell if it's that slave or the slave is acting as a nurse. But either way, it's clear that they're laboring up to at least the day before they deliver their child. Now, some economists have collected data from all of these records and analyzed it. And they find that over the period from 1820 to 1860, cotton picking rates per slave went up something like fourfold. So people got much, much more efficient at picking cotton. Now, there are a variety of reasons why this occurred, one of which is the adoption of easier to pick strains of cotton. There's a biological innovation process where the types of cotton that are being planted can be picked faster. But the other side of it is this information technology, which allowed planters to ratchet up the pace of labor. They're seeking all the time to figure out exactly the maximum that any slave can pick and to force him to pick that maximum. So the first step to doing that is to keep these kinds of detailed records and to figure out how much they think each slave can pick. But they also do all kinds of other things, like they hold contests where they divide the enslaved peoples into multiple groups, and they held a contest within each group, and then the slave who picks the most cotton would receive a small payment. Now, of course, if you read slave narratives, slaves knew what was actually happening, which is planters were pushing them to reveal how much labor they could actually do, because however much labor however much you picked would become your new target. And that premium that's paid would be a very small in comparison to the amount of benefit that the planter was set to receive. Some planters did pay premiums for overachievement of targets, just regularly, not just in a contest basis. So they might pay a premium per pound over a target of something like $2.50. But again, a premium was a technique designed to encourage the enslaved man or woman to pick as much as possible and reveal how much cotton they could pick. And if you picked well above your target over a long period of time, you could be certain that that target was going to increase. And you find slaves discussing this in slave narratives, and they talk about conducting slowdowns and things like that to keep people from pushing up the pace of labor. And the other thing to remember is, we have here the calculating rationality of the numbers, but the most commonly used method to ratchet up the pace of labor is probably whipping, and you find numerous slave narratives that mention not only being punished for falling short of their targets, but receiving a lash for every pound that they fall short. So each additional pound is thus kind of incentivized. Now, in many, you don't find this type of detailed calculation almost anywhere else in this time period. This one's a little bit later, it's from 1860, but they begin keeping these types of records from the 1830s, and they keep them in the pre-formatted records by the 1840s. What you also find that's distinctive on these southern plantations is the degree of analysis they do with the records. So, just two items to look at. One is the tallies of picking each day and the running total over the course of the year. Planters wrote to each other to see how their picking compared to other plantations at the same point in the year. They also compared it to prior years, forecasting how much they believed they would have if the current rates continued. The quote on the right comes from a plantation account book where he's falling short of his targets, and he writes, "If the deficiency for the whole season is proportionate to that occurring up to the 7th of February, it will amount to 605,000 bales, pounds. If for the balance of the seasons it should be at the rate occurring from January 17th to February 7th, it will amount to," and then he has another amount. So he's basically making a projection of how much they can expect to produce over the course of the year. Even more kind of sophisticated than this process of projecting and comparing are this kind of long division that's happening down here. So we've got this planter has taken this sum total over the course of the season, and they're dividing it by 1400 and by 1300, and elsewhere they divide it by 1350. So they're experimenting with these different numbers, which are the amount that they would expect a prime hand to pick in a week. So we saw here the range up to almost 1700, with most slaves falling around 900. So the 1350 or 1400 or 1300 were what they're hoping their kind of average prime hand is going to pick. So they take the sum total, they divide it by that 1300, and they find out the number of prime hand weeks that have thus been expended in the picking of cotton thus far that season. And this is a kind of attempt to take their multiple different slaves and sum them into an equivalence that's comparable to other plantations. So they may have a set of enslaved people who's particularly young and robust, and therefore they'd have a large number of prime hands. Maybe their 80 slaves would be equal to 60 prime hands. Or you might have a weaker array of people, so it takes 100 total hands to be equal to 60 prime hands. And this kind of calculation of the prime hand plays out through not only the account books, but also the Southern Agricultural Press. Here you can see it in action. This is a list of all of the slaves on Frost and Horry Plantation, and they're all being rated in units of quarter hands. So down the left-hand side, these are full hands, and these are hands that are not full. Atha rated at 3/4 of a hand, the Cripple Susie rated at 0, the cook Tissy rated at half, Tom half, and so it continues. So they're actually using these like fractional units of the fractional person to add up their labor force to make it comparable to other labor forces. And you can see that playing out. Here are just two excerpts from articles that were written in the Southern Agricultural Press. I'll start with the one on the right. This is a description of the capital that you need to spend in order to put together a new plantation growing cotton on a large scale. They recommend 50 prime hands, 50 half hands, and 50 quarter hands. So you want a mix of these kind of different levels of hand. And this would be equal to, I haven't done the math, what about like 85 total hands. So that would be your kind of equivalence that you have, and then you could have slaves that were spread across all the different tasks. Similarly here, you have all this productivity data, yield of cotton per acre, average price per pound, net proceeds per hand. And typically net proceeds per hand could either be per slave, but it might also be per prime hand, this kind of strange amalgam of the commoditized life being summed up to made equivalent to others. So the planters were always trying to optimize the value of their slaves both as labor and as capital. This was kind of a dance between trying to extract the most labor on a day-to-day basis, but also thinking about how you could maintain and increase the value of your capital investment. So all of these that we've looked at so far are really about extracting more labor on a short-term basis. And the last record I want to show you from Southern Plantations is about the value of the enslaved as capital. So this is Form I from Thomas Affleck's Plantation Record and Account Book. It's the annual record of Negroes on Pleasant Hill Plantation, which was owned by Eli Capel. It was in Mississippi. And the way that this was filled out at the beginning of the year and the end of the year. You have all the names, you have all the ages, you have the value at the beginning of the year, and then you have the value at the end of the year. And what planters are supposed to do is to assess, based on the change in value, any appreciation or depreciation in the value of their slaves. Now, within business history, depreciation is usually regarded as the most important accounting advancement of probably since the Industrial Revolution. If you're not an accountant, depreciation is a way that you calculate the declining value of your fixed assets over time, and then you can use that to allocate them to production costs. So people usually date it to the rise of the railroads, and it doesn't show up in textbooks until about 1880. And here we have Thomas Affleck, more than 30 years earlier, giving instructions that planters consider any appreciation or depreciation in the value of their slaves. So you would record the value at the beginning of the year and the value at the end of the year, and there's lots of reasons why a slave's value could change. This is a year when almost every slave's value goes up. So one of the likely driver for the changes here is changes in the market price. But you also see large increases in the value of slaves who are going from age 12 or 13 to 14, 15, 16, becoming an age where they're going to be very valuable for laboring. And you also see older or sickly slaves going down in value. So after completing these two inventories, the planter would total them all up, would add credits for these two new babies born on the plantation. They're valued at $100 each. And the difference between the value at the beginning of the year and the value at the end of the year was the increase in your capital stock. So you had not only any profits that you earned from the picking of cotton, but also the profits you earned from the increasing value of the slaves as assets. Now this number, of course, didn't always go up. And even when it did go up, it wasn't always clear what planters should do with that information. All these planters wished to keep planting cotton. Most of their income came from labor. So sometimes, in this particular case, Eli Capel, the planter here, records a hearty profit on his balance sheet, but almost all of the profit comes from the increase of the value of his slaves. And that wasn't actually money he could access. He might have been able to use it to collateralize a loan, and many did use slaves as collateral for mortgages. But this wasn't money that he could actually liquidate to spend. So in Capel's case, he understood that his profit was appreciating, but actually the following year he fills this out at the beginning of the year, but he never fills it out again because this isn't actually helping him to run his plantation more effectively. Many planters do fill it out, and there's an eerie parallel here with the rise of the railroads. So usually when people have said, well, why do people start doing depreciation when they do? They tell a story about the railroad that says, look, the railroads have huge investments in complex, long-lived assets. And they have to account for those investments or else they don't know what their costs are. Their variable costs are small compared to their fixed costs, compared to their capital investments. So unless they calculate what their cars and tracks are worth and how it's changing over time, they cannot assess the profitability of their enterprise. And the same thing is true for the enslaved. By far, the planter's largest investment is in this most complex of long-lived capital assets. It's hard to imagine a more complex and long-lived asset than a human life. And there's far more complexity to account for in any way than in the kind of pricing of a caboose. But this was the key to unlocking their productivity. And so they had to figure out how to assess this human capital and to think about its profitability in the same way they thought about slaves. So I want to give a little bit of time for discussion, but I'll close just with a couple of comments on quantification and control. Because after all, there's been a huge resurgence recently in interest in slavery and capitalism. If you're in history, there have been several big books arguing that slavery was extremely capitalistic. But in a lot of those settings, the argument is advanced in a way that says, well, slavery and capitalism happened together. They weren't incompatible. And I think looking at the accounts actually has the potential to unlock the ways that they're related. Because planters had so much control over their slaves, so much access to violence, so much ability to allocate and reallocate, and to direct, although they often failed, production and reproduction, that these columns of numbers are incredibly useful. When I compare these records to records for northern factories, you have kind of northern payrolls are full of turnover. Like lots of factories from this time period have turnover as much as 100 people per year. I've been reading the history of a Maryland chemical factory that employed both slaves and free laborers. And among the free laborers, turnover reaches 100% per year regularly. So the enslaved can actually be forced and trained and made to kind of abide by these numbers in ways that free laborers cannot. So quantification, control are feeding on each other. And the conditions of slavery are making the numbers more valuable. At the same time, I think it's worth a note of caution. Whenever in some ways this observation is probably a little bit banal to historians of science, but usually when I present these records, people say, but this just really depicts the violence of numbers. You can just see the violence of numbers here. And I think that's a really dangerous conclusion because the account books themselves aren't the agents of violence. The violence is being committed by people. The account books are kind of a tool in that process. And if you look at the account books, you actually, I don't really need this last picture. You see a much more complex and indeterminate story. If you could see the picture up here, it's a record of punishment on the plantation. Let's see. I'm going to unplug this and replug this, and then I'll... In any case, there's a record of punishment on the plantation. In some ways, this record is even more harrowing than those inventories of lives where people are putting dollar values on slaves' lives. It shows people being sent to solitary confinement for being unruly. It shows the number of lashes that they're whipped, like numbers of lashes that seem to me totally terrifying. But if you actually consider the function of this book, kind of after that first layer of reactions, this was a requirement instituted by ameliorationists working in London against the slave trade to first curb the excesses of violence. So it's a record of the offenses, time and place of punishment, who inflicts the punishment, and the witness. And it's meant actually to prevent excesses of punishment and to be able to punish planters who are excessively violent towards their slaves. So this is the account book, the numbers being used in exactly the opposite purpose. Another really interesting circumstance that you find on slave using West Indian account books is that they're also used by abolitionists to kind of do a demography of slavery. The British lawyer Stephen James published a volume about the nature of West Indian slavery, and his main piece of evidence in the text is a plantation journal. He uses the plantation journal to reconstruct death rates on 2 plantations on the island of St. Christopher. In 1812, there were 140 enslaved, and by 1815, the numbers plummeted to 108, and by 1819 to 86. And he recounts the causes of their deaths and uses this as evidence to argue against slavery. He also offers to deposit the plantation journal itself, kind of evidence, with a local bookseller so that anyone who wants can go and consult this kind of apparently unbiased source of information. So account books, as of course any kind of quantifying process or even any kind of a narrative accounting, both erased the violence and made it visible. And in different hands, these same documents were both tools for instruments of labor coercion and also potentially tools for emancipation. Thank you.